online. If you're watching the recording on Dave, I hope you had a good New Year. Firstly, I promise I do work for RSSB, despite appearances. I know I look ridiculous. It's a midlife crisis. At least I've got my own sunroof for when it's a nicer day than this one. I always start with a silly line or two like that because this is quite a dark presentation. It's not a funny thing. There are no gags throughout. In fact, we do have a bit of footage of the Southall incident happening. Now, if that's not for you, when we get to the Google Earth map on slides, if you want to switch your screen off, or if you want to step out, that's absolutely.
We seem to have lost sound.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I've turned my microphone on and I'm bouncing back at myself, which may Retro garments. The black turtleneck by British host. Come out of it.
Sarah, see us and hear us again now.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, well, we'll make a start then. I'm going to do what I can't do online, which is put my camera off. So the equivalent in real time is to take my specs off, of course, because if I can't see you, you can't see me. That's how it works. And I'm already fed up with seeing all of you. I seem to have done much else. Right, as I say, this is a dark story. So we'll start it now. Through the noise of screeching and twisting metal, I became aware of people screaming, shouting, and crying. It took me a fraction of a second to realize why the screaming worried me so much. Because it was men I could hear. Men screaming in appalling pain and terror. It was far and away the most disturbing and frightening thing I'd ever experienced in my life. So wrote this woman, Pam Warren, in 2014. She was looking back to 1999, to October the 5th, to just after 08:05 when a train left Paddington bound for Bedwin. Its driver, Michael Hodder, had passed a double yellow and a single yellow aspect beforehand, acknowledged the AWS twice, acknowledged it a third time, before striking an incoming HST. 31 people, including both drivers, were killed. Hundreds more were injured, including Pam, who was in a coma for 3 weeks, and whose severe burns required her to wear a perspex shield to minimize facial scarring. She became known as the Lady in the Mask and went on to found the Paddington Survivors Group, becoming a spokesperson and advocate for railway safety. And more than once did she ask us what we were doing to stop more people being killed or maimed like she had been. I'm glad to say she's still doing it, incidentally. The immediate cause of the accident at Ladbroke Grove was, of course, a signal passed at danger, a spat. And your screen hasn't caught up with me, it seems. Maybe someone should refresh.
It's online. It has online.
That's fine. On the face of it, our industry had been very active in dealing with SPADs. Indeed, the origins of train protection came out of a fatal SPAD and collision that occurred at Slough as far back as 1900. I won't pore over the details today, but the investigation revealed that perhaps the most disturbing thing about that accident wasn't that the driver hadn't obeyed the signals, but that he couldn't explain why. Part of the first Great Western's reaction was to develop apparatus that would sound a bell in the cab if a distance was clear, and a siren if it was at caution. This recognised, there we go, that as trains were getting faster, distance signals were becoming more important because, of course, they gave drivers more time to slow down for a stop signal up ahead.
With an arm injury, struggled for the rest of the year. Even in May this year, he turned up at the Geneva Open. He was in danger of dropping outside the top 100 and had to go through qualifying. That was where
I'll make a note of that for later. Trialled on the Henley branch as long ago as 1906, believe it or not. The equipment was later developed so that if a driver passed a caution and failed to acknowledge the warning, the brakes would automatically come on. We're stuck again. Never mind. In this form, what became known as automatic train control would be fitted to over 3,000 locomotives and nearly 3,000 Great Western track miles by 1939, and would contribute a great deal to that company's excellent safety record. Indeed, it would be the forerunner of every train protection system that came after, including, hopefully, AWS, although that was more heavily based on a similar London, Midland and Scottish railway system. Either way, in one of the bitter ironies of railway safety, and there have been a few, British Railways was developing AWS just as the terrible multi-SPAD double collision occurred at Harrow and Wealdstone in 1952. Claiming 112 lives, it was second only to the famous Quinton's Hill disaster of 1915 in terms of fatalities. It is, in fact, Britain's worst peacetime train accident, and I do hope it always remains so. AWS had been installed between King's Cross and Grantham by 1956. By 1960, it had reached York and would go on to reduce the SPAD rate and SPAD risk, risk equals frequency times consequence, enormously. At least it did, rather like my slides when it worked. And the fact that it didn't was in the causal chain of the accident at Southall, which came just 2 years before Ladbroke Grove. And on my screen, we're now getting to the moment where you might want to leave if you don't want to see the footage. But it's taking a little while to come through on here, of course. At around 13:10, on Friday the 19th of September 1997, driver Larry Harrison started packing up his holdall with his diagram and his notices. Rounding the left-hander ahead of Southall, he suddenly saw a red signal up ahead. As the lines straightened out in front of him, he saw a Class 59 diesel-electric locomotive at what he would later describe as a funny angle. A collision was inevitable. He rammed on the brake. He knew there was nothing more he could do. He left his seat and hid behind the bulkhead door. By the time he emerged again, his train would be in disarray, 6 people would be dead with another soon to follow, and 139 would be injured. By 7 that evening, he'd be arrested. And here is the footage. I always feel something for the person in the yellow high-vis down here, desperate to do something. What can he do? All he can do is run. There was soon speculation about Harrison after it was reported that he'd been spotted pulling into Bristol Parkway with both feet up on the driving desk. You might remember the news stories about that. The problem for him was that whilst his record was good, unblemished bar a couple of slow-speed spads in the 70s and an incident in 1996 when he set off without the right of way, he'd not only passed Sierra November 254 at red, but had also unheeded the single and double yellow in the run-up. By the time he'd been charged with manslaughter the following April, Professor Uff's public inquiry had begun. By the time that had been published, Ladbroke Grove had happened. This second incident led to a joint report into train protection systems headed by Uff, but also Lord Cullen, who was leading the latter inquiry. AWS had since been joined on the Great Western Main Line and the Chiltern lines out of Marylebone by automatic train protection, which was based on European systems which had been spurred by SPADs like those at Purley and Belgrove in 1989, and which automatically served to restrict the speed of a train on the approach to a signal at danger. And you'll see some pictures of those two in just a moment, hopefully. At Southall, Harrison's inattention coupled up with 40 AWS on the leading power car and non-functioning ATP because Harrison wasn't qualified to use it. At Ladbroke Grove, Hodder's train would have been stopped had it been fitted like the HST involved in that event with ATP. ATP installation within 10 years had in fact been recommended by Hidden in his report on the Clapham accident of 1988. But Hidden had also recommended that the government and British Rail conduct a thorough review of investment appraisal procedures so that a financial value could be put on safety. Thus, in 1994, BR carried out a cost-benefit analysis of the whole project. We're moving on to a set of scales now.
It is online.
Yeah.
I don't understand why it's not on the screen behind us.
Actually, if I click my fingers. No, nothing. The cost-benefit analysis showed a cost per equivalent fatality avoided, a horrible phrase, of £13.9 million based on a full fitment cost of £475 million. As this was way above the level seen as justified by both the Health and Safety Executive and the government, ATP was ruled out, leaving its 2 pilot schemes stranded. So the moral there is, if you like, be careful what you wish for. While the trial sections remained in place, Uff Cullen's report published in January 2001 considered both AWS and ATP to represent old technology anyway. As a result of other systems now being developed, it went on, there is no longer any serious demand for general fitment of ATP. One of those other systems you can see there was the train protection and warning system, once known in enthusiast journals as totally pointless warning system, but it certainly is not. It had been developed as conceived as a development of AWS after it had been concluded that nationwide ATP installation was not, as we saw and as we call it, reasonably practicable. TPWS was, of course, cheaper than ATP, but like ATP, improved on the older AWS by automatically applying the brakes on a train that had passed a fitted signal at danger or was approaching one too fast. Successful trials led to wide-scale installation from 2000. At the time, concerns mainly related to its perceived lack of effectiveness at speeds up to and over 70 miles an hour. Although it would slow a train significantly, the system was later improved, TPWS Plus, in the cunning addition to the slide there, to incorporate additional overspeed sensors, and that made it more effective up to the ton. TPWS, of course, is now very well established, and it has played a large part in cutting the numbers of SPADs from about 500 a year to around something more like 350, the vast majority totally benign on a railway that, pandemic aside, is getting busier again. Yet while SPADs are now relatively low in frequency, one still has the occasional potential for a high consequence loss. With this in mind, an industry-wide steering group reviewed Cullen much more recently to consider whether TPWS has reduced the risk as far as reasonably practicable, to look at whether other solutions can instead be adopted and whether there are better ways of sharing best practice. More slides. At the same time, we at RSSB continue to look at accidents caused by SPADs overseas to check whether they could happen here. I'm pleased to say that the answer is usually no, but there's certainly nothing wrong with looking beyond the boundary fence outside your own signal box, or however you want to put it, to measure yourself. And I think, if nothing else, the terrible accident in India in 2023 demonstrates that was a carbon copy of the Clapham accident in so many ways. Yes, overseas incidents can happen here. So it's always a good thing to keep measuring, keep checking. But train protection is just one part of the whole SPAD issue, of course. And certainly Cullen's report on Ladbroke Grove highlighted a veritable web of causation. First, the approaches to Paddington had been re-signalled for bidirectional working by BR in the early 90s. Many new signal heads were needed, but as space was at a premium, most were mounted on gantries. Trouble was, the curvature of the formation meant it wasn't always obvious to an approaching driver which one was for which line. Reflective line identification signs had been added, but they were closer to the signal to the right than the signal for the line they actually referred to. At the time of the accident, all the signals on the gantry that held Sierra November 109, that's gantry 8, were red. But the overhead line equipment for the then new Heathrow Express service, which had been put in with scant regard to signal sighting, also created a situation in which the signal was the last of all of those on gantry 8 to become clearly visible to the driver of a train coming from Paddington. Second, it was argued that Michael Hodder, our turbo driver, had not received adequate training. British Rail's first formal course for footplate staff, known as MP12, had begun in 1973. This remained in use until superseded by the Modular Driver 2000 programme in 1992. In Beyond Hidden Dangers, a book I recommend, Stanley Hall argued that Hodder's training was only loosely based on the BR system and included 4 weeks traction training and 16 weeks practical handling. Cullen revealed that the modified version of Driver 2000 handed over to Thames trains in 1994 was indeed not being strictly followed by 1998. Alcrow Transmark was later commissioned to examine the situation and noted that signalling maps and plans were available for some routes, but had not been updated with essential information like multi-SPAD signals and so on, obviously signals that had been passed more than once in a fixed time frame. Furthermore, route learning norms did not appear to recognise the risk from inexperience, particularly for newly qualified drivers with no previous operating experience over the route. That's something that we're getting concerned about again with the lowering of the driving age that we're trying to bring in to get more drivers. Hodder had started training on the 1st of February 1999. His first solo shift was on the 22nd of September. That's 33 weeks later, or some 10 weeks fewer than the BR minimum. Although his trainer had taught him that Paddington was quote-unquote tricky, that he should count the signals from right to left to work out which one applied to his line, and that there had been problems with gantry 8, he told the inquiry that he wasn't there to teach the routes, just how to drive a turbo. The trainer, of course, had grown up with the system and had taken it as it evolved. Someone like Hodder was, and it's in the report, just thrown in at the deep end. But until this evidence was given, the training manager had not been aware that the trainer didn't think it was his job to be teaching route knowledge. Hodder and his trainer might not have known that Sierra November 109 was a multi-spare signal, but his company, the operator of the time, hadn't helped them to know it either. There was something of a problem with the infrastructure manager on the same point. No one, in fact, was taking a holistic view. If there'd been a number of Claphams in the making before Clapham, as the hidden report revealed that there indeed had been, there were a number of potential Ladbroke Groves before Ladbroke Grove as well. In fact, between the 1st of February 93 and the 2nd of July 99, there had been 67 SPADs in the Paddington area, and it got worse after the OLE had been put in. The layout had been conceived with the use of ATP in mind to prevent collision prevention safety, as it says in the report. We probably call it flank protection. But ATP was only fitted to Great Western HSTs. And most of the SPADs involved Thames turbo units. On the 10th of November 1995, indeed, a turbo passed Royal Oak's Sierra November 74 signal at danger and struck a Great Western HST. The driver of the former had read the wrong signal on gantry 5 that time. Only one person was injured, but the resulting report noted that the methods of route learning into and out of Paddington appeared very informal. It also noted that of a total of 37 SPADs in the Paddington area at that point, 21 had occurred at gantries, including 12 where the driver had mistaken the correct signal. On the 4th of February 98, an HST did pass Sierra November 109 at danger, its driver misunderstanding a route indication received at the previous signal. When he realised he wasn't going down the down main, he threw out the anchors, but still passed the signal by over 400 yards. He stopped short of the fouling point, so a collision with an incoming train didn't occur, but it was the 6th SPAD at Sierra November 109. There would be 2 more before Ladbroke Grove. Issues of sighting, of layout and confusion kept coming up. The data was there, the recommendations kept flowing, but they all seemed to fall into an administrative void. No one at Railtrack's Great Western Zone seemed to take responsibility or be given it. Indeed, to quote Cullen, the zone had no procedure for handling recommendations. There was also, perhaps more damningly, a culture of apathy and a lack of will to follow up on promised actions. The only person putting all this together was Alison Forster, First Great Western's then Director of Operations and Safety. Time and time again, she voiced her concern about SPADs in the Paddington area. Time and time again, she urged Railtrack to take action. Time and time again, she attended meetings where there were plenty of ideas, but no subsequent actions. She told of a lack of clarity about who at Railtrack was meant to be dealing with SPADs. She told of how in August 1998 she'd written to Railtrack's production manager about Sierra November 109, asking as a matter of urgency what he intended to do about this high-risk signal. She never received a full response. For Forster, Railtrack did not look very often at some of the big picture issues. They tended to be reactive to incidents. They did not, she said, seem to be a learning organisation. Cullen's own recommendations, as 14 and 55, if you look them up in the manner I described earlier, advocated such a learning organisation, to wit, an independent body to set standards, accredit product and service suppliers, establish and manage system authorities, fund and sponsor research and development, monitor safety performance, share good practice, and provide safety leadership. You might be able to guess where I'm going with this. These functions were largely being addressed by Railtrack Safety and Standards Directorate at the time, but by the time Cullen appeared, it had become more politically acceptable to pull the one out and separate them. Thus, railway safety initially, and then RSSB, we morphed from the one to the other, came into being. The overarching lesson of Ladbroke Grove and his Reason's famous Swiss cheese model, Reason is incidentally instrumental in BR's first ever safety plan in 1991. We just didn't necessarily carry the torch onwards. Never mind. Change increases risk, or can do. Change the driver training, change the signal layout, change your organisational structure, and if you haven't handled it properly, your failings could line up in the form of an accident. We know all this, of course, but we also know our industry can never afford to be complacent. Though Cullen said the current signal sighting standard needed replacing or revising, and though it was and has been several times since, Pre-pandemic RSSB analysis showed that new signalling schemes can still contribute to SPADs. So could new traction, it being found that the rear static brakes on some new stock can be impaired by using the driver reminder appliance on the move. So though could new timetables when they impact on driver workload and lead to the sorts of fatigue and concentration related issues that we could all do with that. RSSB's work, of course, was based on a pretty small sample size, but the underlying causes suggest the industry should consider reviewing its SPAD risk management strategies whenever changes are made. TPWS, of course, to minimise the risk in these situations. It will do in a minute, there we go. While too late for Ladbroke Grove, it undoubtedly has helped reduce SPAD risk to a much lower level, but it isn't fail-safe, doesn't offer ceiling speed supervision, cannot regulate a train speed on the approach to a red signal, and doesn't always guarantee that a train will stop in the overlap. And as the SPAD and near miss just up the road at Wootton Bassett Junction in March 2015 showed, its technology can also be overridden by the human element. That involved a steam locomotive fitted with TPWS, admittedly, but it was a reset and continue, as we would describe it. And because it was a big, heavy steam locomotive, I think we were something like, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 90 seconds from it cutting into the side of a Mark III carriage or a train going across the junction. We don't want near misses quite that near. The F. Cullen inquiry had supported TPWS, but had seen it as an interim solution, pending the introduction of the European Train Control System, which, of course, as you know, provides ATP functionality and which they were told could be rolled out from around 2008. Yes, indeed. Yet, wider ETCS implementation is proving to be slow. It's there on the Thameslink core, of course. It's there on the lines out of Paddington for GWR, I think. It's there on the Cambrian line, although not without software issues, as RAIB has also fairly recently explained. But it's expensive, requires government backing, and governments seldom take the long-term view of infrastructure, assets, anything at all much, really. And in a big conference scenario, I'd probably do just two, or something like that, which is very cheeky. What it means, though, in the world of operations and signalling, is that we're going to have overlays with us for some time, which is where we have ETCS functionality for some trains, but we have line-side signals as well. If we watch Red 72, which is our latest frontline briefing film, it covers ETCS introduction. Justin Willett, director at Network Rail and an all-round good egg, describes overlays as the worst of both worlds, because we know it could be problematic. There is an argument that line-side signals will help drivers driving even on ETCS to have the landmarks that they've become used to with their route knowledge training, which was something of a problem for Mr. Hodder. But it's something we need to be mindful of. It's a change we're bringing in, and you can see what can happen when we bring in changes. Back to the more positive. Since F. Cullen, since Ladbroke Grove, other train protection systems have emerged or reached maturity. Monitoring has indeed improved. Cab design has improved. Signal sighting now uses 3D technology. That would have been science fiction back in 1999. We've come a long way. Our whole understanding of human factors has increased exponentially. What did that mean in 1999? Not an awful lot. Originally, when I wrote this presentation, I used to say since Ladbroke Grove, there hasn't been a fatal collision resulting from a SPAD. We have to wait because RAIB's report on Ladbroke isn't out yet, the full version. It may be that we can no longer say that. So we have to be mindful. The trouble with this story and a lot of the others is that Ladbroke Grove is now, like Clapham, part of our corporate memory. And as more and more of our people retire and more new people come in to replace them, what we learned, what we changed for the better, and how and why we did so, risk fading and vanishing unless we make some kind of an effort to remember. You will have seen the book cover Red for Danger up there very briefly as I was trying to guess where the slides were going to go. I mention it most times I speak in this sort of way. I believe it still is a vital corporate memory aid written in the mid-50s, but it still has a lot to teach us now, even now. So I do recommend that. But I recommend Hidden as well. I recommend Cullen, and the F. Cullen report. Indeed, RAIB found Hidden in its recent investigations into the related low-speed collision at Waterloo, the signalling irregularity at Cardiff, and since then, the ECS derailment at Dalwhinnie, the two in a bed to South Wingfield, 4 RAIB reports with causal chains that map on to the Clapham causal chain, just not all the way to the terrible fatal accident that we had with Clapham. But the warning bells were there before Odisha happened in India. I think that's quite telling. You need to be, when you read something, sometimes you need to read a little bit beyond what actually happened to extrapolate what could have happened. If you look at, I think it's the Waterloo one, there's a big appendix at the back of Rabe's report where it does the mapping across to the Clapham report for you. It's worth a scan. Rabe's own reports, of course, are a vital source of corporate knowledge, and they've been going for over 20 years now too. And it's a default setting with a lot of us. We've had a SPAD, we've had a derailment, reminds me of so-and-so. What did Rabe say about it? What did the old railway inspectorate say about it? Looking at the older report is always the best starting point for the writing of the new one or the new project, the new thinking. They're all great tools to help answer that question that Pam posed us. And as I say, I'm pleased to report he's still posing. What are we doing to stop more people being killed or hurt like she had been? Thank you for listening. I'm sorry we had a bit of a technical snafu there. I'm sure it's RSSB's fault. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you for your patience. I'll gladly take any questions, or I'll also gladly leave. It's your choice. Thank you. Do we have any questions online? Or?
There's no questions online, presently. But there are still people here, so they hopefully have been listening all the way through. And
yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
A great talk, Greg, as always. Thank you. Obviously, we could debate endlessly to what extent the organisational change of going from British Rail to Railtrack and the train operators influenced that accident.
Yes.
But it clearly did have an influence to a greater or less extent. We're about to go into another generational, huge organisational change with GBR.
Mm.
What does the industry need to do differently to try and prevent that change from creating conditions for another Ladbroke Grove?
It's a great question, Gary. How long have you got?
Yeah, I appreciate it's not a straightforward one to answer.
I think we need to be mindful of our past. There've been a few comments on LinkedIn just lately. Why don't you talk to those of us who were here last time? That does tessellate with something I do say quite a lot. If you're younger, talk to somebody older. If you're older, talk to somebody younger. I think not all older ideas are bad, not all new ideas are good, but it's vice versa as well. That's why it's so difficult. But if you get and talk to each other, you can work that through. I firmly believe that we've lost our ability to be discerning about various learning points. There's a bit of a tendency to think, oh, well, all that stuff that happened back then is completely irrelevant now. I think this demonstrates it isn't. There are lines you can draw. I won't do them now, but there are lines from Ladbroke Grove to the Salisbury Tunnel Junction collision, which was only 2021. Chalfont and Latimer near miss. There are similarities in various parts of the causal chain. I think if fools like me come along and tell stories, but they do it so you can see why it could still happen, that will help. But it has to be done at a micro level. We're doing as much as we can at RSSB to share these thoughts and concerns. We're in fact trying to feed into GBR some of this learning, because it isn't just railway, of course. The Nimrod accident, the Mid-Staff's NHS debacle a few years ago, Fukushima, Deepwater Horizon. There are a lot of big process accidents where it would ring alarm bells. Just on the railway, though, I do think it's very important that we keep rooted to the past, but be careful about what's relevant. That idea from 1940 still works. That one from 1955, not so great. This one from 3 weeks ago, brilliant. I don't know how you get that discernment and that power of thought back. As we were kind of talking in the kitchen, I don't think you're going to get it from AI. Maybe one day, but not yet. It is about keeping it human and talking to people with longer careers. I work with a guy called Michael Woods who started in the railway in 1973. And he said something very interesting. He said, I can't remember what I can remember until you talk to me. And it's the human contact, the conversation about this project or that kind of bridge or this sort of operational incident that lets him open the right drawer in the filing cabinet of his head and the relevant stuff comes out. I worry that we're going to have a lot of people go when the change comes, like we did from BR into Railtrack. And I think it was Roger Ford who said that when somebody was, say, 20 years experience on the railway leaves, they don't take 20 years of knowledge with them. It's something more like 100 years because of all the knowledge they picked up from all of those conversations they had when they started and throughout. I think we need to be very careful that there's a place for the old world in the new one. Otherwise, a knowledge gap is, I fear, going to open up. It's not it's a bit of a riffing jazz sort of answer, but I think we need to keep talking to each other. We need to keep reading the relevant things and question everything. Never be afraid to ask questions, whatever grade you are in whatever industry, actually. Ask questions, because you're never going to be wrong to ask. You might have got hold of the wrong end of the stick coming to you, sir, but you're never going to be wrong to ask the question. Something like that. Anyway, thank you. Yes, sir.
SPAD is single pass of danger.
That's right. Yes, sorry.
ATP is automatic. And when they started that, accidents went down, but then it sort of got as it's got more and more complex, speeds have gone up, it's got more and more. But mainly a SPAD is a manual error by a driver. But from the beginning, they started to use ATP, which was trying to stop the trains automatically.
Yeah.
And for instance, the other one where there's another famous one where the intercity smashed through a train that had gone across the tracks. That was also a horrific one. That driver had ATP on it, but he wasn't enabled.
Yes.
He didn't have a mobile phone. The wireless was not working. All of this is manual input.
Yes.
The train took over a kilometre to stop. So it basically went straight through the wagon. It burst into flames. Lots of people were killed, etc. All manual error. But in the Europeans, they now have this automatic. But even so, and they now the signals have gone. It's now in the cab.
Yes.
But what if the driver there is in the toilet or doesn't give a shit about it and does the same as these drivers? He hasn't read the manual. He hasn't gone through the proper training. I know you don't like AI, and I don't necessarily want AI to. I don't want to go on an AI train either. But there are automatic systems that could be used. The only reason they're not used is generally because the rail companies don't want to bother if it goes wrong and trains can't run. They'd rather see an accident than have things stop. And I do believe that it is within the normal technology without AI to have an automatic train system. And you shouldn't have trains going past red lights. If it's a red light and there's a signal there, if it's in the cabin, if it's on the line side, the train should not go past. You should be like a gatekeeper. Ask 3 questions. No, if you get them all wrong, you cannot pass.
Well, we do have ATO on the Thameslink core. It's on Victoria line, of course, since the 60s. It's there on the Thameslink core where you filter in from an ETCS scenario into automatic train operating when you're under the tunnel, and then you come out the other side and go back into ETCS. I mean, it will come eventually. I think it's money. Back to the point about the government release of funding. We're about to be renationalised again. I mean, the Clapham accident happened in part because the funding wasn't there for the the Waterloo Area Resignalling Scheme, which was first mooted in 1978. Now, 1978, if you were there at the time, was a really, really, really bad time for public spending. A lot of strikes, plug pulled. So the scheme was written down, and it was only passed as okay by Nicholas Ridley, I think, the then Transport Secretary, in the mid-80s. So it waited about 6 years. It's the same kind of situation with this, only we're now, though we're all going to be vertically integrated and everything's going to be wonderful under GBR, it may be, it still means a lot of government control over what you can, the external financing limit, as it used to be called. So I would question, I'm not right at the forefront in all of this by any means, but I would question how quickly automatic train operation will spill over to other routes if we're having trouble expanding ETCS, which is an improvement on TPWS. because of the money. So we're going to have this human machine interaction in various different ways for some time to. We'll still have semaphore signals and 3-aspect, 4 aspects for some time to come as well, of course.
You mentioned semaphore, which is basically just a sign to me.
Yeah.
And Tom's used to bang on his ear to the train to the track to see if a train was coming, iron horse, all that sort of stuff. Why just have one system ETS? That's just in the cab. That's all based on signaling, etc. You could also combine this with things like optical cable, so that you could listen to the track. So you could use sensory optical cables. If anything wanted to emerge, stop the train, you bang on the track. You make a noise. You stop. One of the things with the train. There's all sorts of the accident where there was a horse box that went onto the track. The first train hit it, not a problem, but it derailed. Then 15 minutes, 25 minutes later, another train. It's about 45 minutes after the initial crash comes in, kills the driver, and another 11 people died. With the one that went through the wagon, there was quite a long time whilst that train was stuck across. Nobody did anything. Nobody stuck a metal pipe across the tracks to close the signals. Nobody did anything at all. If you had sensory, just making a noise on the track would stop it.
Carsten, how many false positives do you think that system would give then?
Loads, but the point is you can train.
So as a passenger, I'm not particularly happy about that. I want to be safe, yes,
that's
but I
what
also
we-
don't want my train constantly delayed by random people hitting something on the track and stopping the train.
Well,
You've got to think through the whole system implications
kids were on the track.
of any safety feature.
Yes, but you can identify the sound. I know they things like that could be used and should be looked into, but they're not. No, I haven't got any knowledge of any train in the UK.
I think you'll find there are some considerable number of trials going on with
Okay.
the optical, acoustic sensing. But the problem is repeatability and also determining and uniquely determining what you're listening to, because it's very hard to filter certain events from certain other events that are occurring. So there's a company called Crouch, they make accident counters on the UK network. They have that technology and they was trusted global, where it's related to various systems, whether it be rockfall, detecting intrusions used, that type of technology is used in oil production facilities, but adapting it to the railway, which is quite a noisy environment, especially on level crossings. You've got vehicles crossing over the road. Quite hard to repeatedly detect this stuff.
And it's maybe a question stroke observation thought maybe around remote condition monitoring. So our next speaker in 4 weeks' time is going to be talking about remote condition monitoring for environmental conditions, etc. And I wonder, the railway, when I started, we had track inspectors and ultrasonics examiners walking the railway. Lots and lots of people that don't exist anymore. We're reliant on technology more and more.
Yeah.
And I wondered, some of the learning that signalling has gone through as a system, which largely technology based, we're now introducing technology into other assets on the railway that never had technology before, not in that sense.
No, that's right. And that was probably the catalyst for that was probably Hatfield, which led to a lot more work on the vehicle track interface and systems interface committees, which, funnily enough, RSSB look after for the industry. So yes, back then we were wrong-footed with gauge corner cracking because it was a hidden risk that wasn't detectable by regular ultrasonic testing techniques. But we learned from that. And I think that the problem with going through the change, because you could definitely draw a line, I think, from privatisation to Hatfield more clearly than to Ladbroke Grove, even given the loss of knowledge that the industry had. And it was same guy, Michael Woods, tells me a story where he worked at railway tracks. That's all I need, Michael, to run a railway filing cabinet full of contracts, because that was the culture. It didn't work. It's another thing we need to be mindful of. But yeah, could you, will that be online as well? Because I'd be interested on just hearing it.
It will, yeah.
It's not my area of field of expertise, but it would be interesting to try to sort of link the thoughts up.
If you go into the PWI website, you can see
Well,
YouTube,
Thank you. Yes, sir.
In theory, can't you make sort of the speed detection element of TPWS redundant with, my car, if I do 72, 73 miles an hour, it will start beeping at me and the time will start increasing. Why can't that sort of technology be rolled out to trains, for example, and the trains then doing 75, 80?
But it's not a line speed issue, it's a braking distance issue.
So why isn't it?
In order to stop that signal, you have to get on a certain speed reduction curve.
Yeah,
And that curve is different for every train.
yeah.
So it's complicated.
Yeah, I think ETCS will do that. You drive to the hook,
ETCS
as it's called. So it will give you the speed and it will start bleeping at you if you're even approaching that set speed.
The real question is, do we go and build another advancement on TPWS and spend a lot? This involves lots of money.
Yeah.
Because you've got to roll it out nationwide, right? So do we do that and then roll out ECTS? Or do we spend that money on actually rolling out ECTS and get to the, which is essentially the ultimate end goal, isn't it?
But wasn't there an accident in Spain where a train ran the corner too fast and derailed?
Yeah.
And wasn't that ETCS fitted?
That was a transition between a new system and an old system. That was a flashpoint in particular, a hole in the cheese slice that wasn't necessarily very big. It just happened to be, and the guard was on the phone, and I think the driver was distracted. So the mix of the human and machine again.
He passed the signal in the cabin, wasn't it? It wasn't a signal. Had a red light in the cabin. She ignored, basically. So he was going round the corner.
Yeah.
Wait, twice the speed, I think.
That's right. I think there was something about the rolling stock configuration as well, because it was sort of a truck, a one axle truck, sort of articulated. So there's something about the characteristics of the train as well. So there's another Swiss cheese model for you there with a lot of holes in a lot of different controls. Yes, sir.
This is really about sort of an overall strategy. There's a certain pot of money available for rail.
Yeah.
I wonder whether our processes are good enough, if they exist, that decides based on, I guess, effectiveness and improvement in safety, how to allocate the money across lots and lots of different interventions. So you've got NICE in the NHS that they look at how effective a drug intervention might be and decide, yes, we'll fund it on the NHS. In the rail industry, I'm not sure we have something like that looks at how, we do sort of in business cases look at value of fatality prevented and things like that, but it tends to be on let's just look at this particular intervention. I'm wondering whether is there an adequate process that looks across all the disciplines and all the interventions, all the renewals programs? How do we decide which ones we should be doing, in priority order?
It's an interesting one. We're here to help the industry take a risk-based approach. That's why we took the old British Rail incident management system and built our own, which is now called Safe Insights, and it's got AI technology to try to help allocate a figure to all of these things. The problem is, at the moment, the way the industry is configured, safety is in the eye of the duty holder, not RSSB. All we can do is advise, but it's up to individual companies at the moment to make the decisions about what they implement and what they don't, even if they want to take up the recommendations that one of our R&D reports comes up with. There might be good reasons for doing so, but we can't enforce. The ORR can enforce if they're so minded to, but they don't seem to be doing a lot of enforcing at the moment. Because I think we're all waiting for GPR as part of the problem. I expect that might change as we reorganise, and maybe the numbers will have bigger teeth if that's not too much of a mixture of metaphor. But yes, there's the mechanisms to give you that overview, but there isn't really a process, as you rightly say, to make sure that the right decisions are made as a result of that. Because it's down to you. That's part of our constitution. We're not allowed to do. I think when I started RSSB, we still had an audit function, and we could go around and be really unpopular with a lot of companies. But in the death of the Quangos, which I think was something about 2007 or other, we were taken out of the government, apart from R&D, and we became a member-led organisation, and therefore that's when we lost the ability to say you must do this because look how crazy if you don't. We can still say that. but there's nothing that says that a member organisation, a TOC, a FOC, an IM, or a supplier has to do it.
Is GBR a potential vehicle to improve that?
It's possible. It's not off the record. It's not even impossible that we might be, as RSSB, sucked back in to GBR, back to the days of Railtrack SNSD. There is still a folder in our shared drive called SSD share. That's the last little bit of Railtrack SNSD that we took with us. It's not impossible that they could. Well, we've given you 20 years to try it as a separate organisation. In the next 5 years or so, they could say, well, okay, let's see if we can make it better by going back the other way. We've been centralised, decentralised, all kinds of ways, almost since nationalisation the first time around in 1948. It wouldn't surprise me if they had another go at putting us back inside a wider body. But I don't know, of course. I'm only down here. I'm still in short trousers after a lot of my colleagues at RSSB.
So we've had a question online from David Halliwell. So if David, if you can just come off mute and ask your question. But while you do that, Emma Holster said, thank you very much for your informative talk. The accident was, of course, the beginning of the railway career, but unable to reflect on it prior so many more years of experiences. So unfortunately, you can't stay on longer, hence we But David,
thank you.
Would you like to ask your question?
No, I was just making the observation that Jubilee, Northern, etc. got ATO as well.
Oh, thank you for the addition of Northern. Yeah, I overlooked that. Thank you.
Yeah, because that was what, 2010, somewhere around there.
It's VLR as well.
Yes, yes, it is. Thank you. See, what do I know?
Thank you, David.
Is that it? Anyone else in the room, or should we?
Yeah, just one.
Yes, sir.
No, this following. Thanks for the good presentation. Following this all investigation, the SPAD purely human error, I believe. Following this, the infrastructure, GBW's modern standard, in terms of all talks and talks, what sort of training or mitigation taken to prevent being killed or injured? Just all train operating communities, trainer trainings, particularly this is purely for human error.
Sure. Well, train operators do train their staff, I think, more assiduously as they used to, because we have a much greater understanding of why people make mistakes, the human factors element. And RSSB get a heck of a lot of support in guidance as to what investigators of SPADs at the operator level can look for. And I think particularly Southeastern has a very grown-up approach to it. They don't blame drivers. We tried to stop blaming drivers after Purley, I think in 1989 mostly, but after Ladbroke Grove as well, it started to gain some traction. But it's much more, their investigation interviews are much more about getting to the reasons. Why were you distracted? Not you were distracted out, as would have once been the case, and some drivers still think it is. But why? What happened? What can be done to support a driver? And I think that's a big plus. There is also a cross-industry group that still just focuses on SPADs and their causes, where we get people, one of the things RSSB likes to think it does best, get people round the table to discuss all the different angles. From that, you get a guidance document, which then is recommended to be plugged into various training packages at the company level. So a lot of work still goes on. It's quite easy to say, oh, well, serious SPADs are part of the past. But low risk doesn't mean no accident, just as no accident doesn't mean low risk. It's still something we're all concerned about. C2C, which works out of Fenchurch Street to Southend, was worried that it had two SPADs. I was at a safety conference giving this presentation actually just a couple of weeks ago, and their top safety person said, we're not a two-SPAD company. Now that would be crazy in 1999. You'd never get a train out of a station, arguably, with that kind of attitude. But that's how the culture has changed. It's improved a lot, that we don't tolerate, but we try to work out more why an error is made, not just that an error was made, why, and what can be done to help. Is it moving? Is it changing the sighting on the signal, for example, or is it about rerouting a train because there are too many people on the platform at the time a SPAD train has come in? So all of these various factors that we try to help with. So a lot is done. It is at company level, but we do try to give as much support in the human factors element as RSSB as we can.
So with 109,
yeah,
what's been done to correct it since? Have you started banner repeaters up?
Yeah, it's not there anymore in its same form.
Figured that gantry,
Yeah.
got a new gantry, and reconfigured the way that the aspects work. Don't know if they made any early alterations. But yeah, they did an awful lot. There was a 40-mile-an-hour speed restriction, wasn't there, for several years after that?
Yeah, there was.
The whole approach to Paddington was dropped from 100 to 40. And then eventually they sorted things out, and then
Okay, yeah. Yes, sir.
I was going on from Heath's question. What about the future? Because we will have the European system in Britain. Have you got any knowledge of how they are preparing for things like accident spats? Because that Spanish accident was technically a spat in the sense that he ignored the signal. It was in his cabin. Yeah. So they still will have to Europe.
Well, we do get what you would call a SPAD on the Thameslink core sometimes, only it's past a marker board rather than a signal. But they're investigated in exactly the same way as a SPAD. And the guy who, if you watch Red 72, all you need to do is log on to RNV and click on the link. You see a guy called Jim O'Donnell who works for GTR, who is like the top guy for training in this country, training front line. And he is very heavily involved working with us in the transitional period, moving from the one system to the next. Hence Justin Willett's comment about the worst of both worlds, having the overlay in. We know it's a risk. It's one that we can't get away from because of funding in the industry. You know, and you might have a passenger train driving on ETCS quite quickly, but it'll be a long time before the freight trains on the same route are fitted, for example. So we know that there is a risk to be managed there. It's just that we're trying to support the industry in managing it, working with people like Jim, because I think GTR and the Thameslink core are kind of the premium, currently the premium mainline operation using TCS. That's coming on LNER, I know as well. So yeah, we know it's a problem. We're just trying to help the industry navigate through it because we kind of haven't got much choice without the funding to just change everything as quickly as we all would like to, unfortunately.
There's still the CTS, but there's no signal.
HS2. Yeah. I'm afraid I'm not averse with HS2. I know on HS1 I think they've got TVM 500.
HS2 will have ECTS.
Right, there you go.
I think.
Yes, the HS2 is ETCS because it's a TS like light railway, and it will have ATM over ETCS currently.
Right, there we go.
HS1 is being re-equipped with ETCS because TVM 413 is getting life expired.
We'll have to change our
a lot of high-speed one
train
structure needs to next sort of 5 to 10 years. So they're facing a big sort of route refit.
Of course, we can't. Here's a sobering thought to finish on. Maybe. Yes, we're still worried about SPAS, but as Hidden demonstrated with the Clapham accident, British Rail was looking at SPAS exclusively. It was right to do so. From the mid-80s onwards, there were some very nasty fatal SPAS. So it put a lot of resource looking at signal pass of danger incidents. Purley and Belgrove in 1989, early 1989, showed they were right. And what they didn't do was look at wrong side failures. And the wrong side failures, which is what Clapham was, were mounting up and mounting up and mounting up. And it bit them eventually. You kind of got to have eyes everywhere. That's what we try to do at RSSB, is offer a statistical picture that lets you look. But as I mentioned in the previous answer, the industry has to kind of take on board what we're suggesting to them. And to say, well, okay, I'm looking at SPAS and I'm right to look at SPAS. But platform train interface is quite a big risk as well, because we've got that awful thing, movable freight involved. That is really, if it's hard to control the driver in the cab to do the right thing, it's even more difficult to tell passengers how to behave, etc., etc. It's a very wide spectrum that we kind of have to work out where to target the most. And it's always going to be wrong for somebody.
Good place to stop. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Round of applause. See you in 4 weeks' time. Thanks, everyone.
certainly look at that session.